Prince Angie Lowlands, the middle way, of Britain King, the answer I expect, Spaniels and Wolves, Unbalanced Christendom, and Continual Curse. Now this book is from 1974. And it's by Antonia Fraser. So let's begin at the beginning. The Burn. It is no matter of his tears, better that Burns should weep than bearded men. That's a quote from the Master of Clams about King James. James Stuart, the son of Mary Queen of Scots, was born on the 19th of June, 1566, in Edinburgh Castle. The small, cramped room in the south-east corner of the fortress can still be seen today, with the joint initials of mother and son on the ceiling. So, I think this is the room here, where King James was born. Blue taffeta had been commanded for the laying in bed, 10 ells of Holland for the cradle, and even the midwife received a grant of velvet for her dress. In spite of these precautions, it was a difficult birth, and when the baby was finally born between 10 and 11 in the morning, he had a thin, fine caul stretched over his face. On the subject of her long ordeal, Mary said afterwards that she had been so handled that she began to wish she had never been married. In fact, the Queen had a more serious motive to regret her marriage to her cousin, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, than the physical sufferings of childbirth. The royal couple, who had produced James, glamorous, tall like gods as they might be, were by this point united only by their elegant physical appearance. James, their single offspring, came into an atmosphere of marital strife, murder, plot, counterplot, in which hints of his own illegitimacy seemed the least of his future troubles. The true bone of contention between James's parents was Darnley's position in relation to the Scottish crown. Mary, having returned to Scotland a widow after the death of her first husband, Francis II, King of France, needed to marry again. She dallied with the idea of a number of suitable and unsuitable spouses before falling in love with her own cousin, son of the Earl and Countess of Lennox. Subsequently, it proved to be a disastrous choice, but it was always likely to be a dangerous one, since Darnley, like Mary herself, had Tudor royal blood, and thus lay within the line of succession to the English throne. Queen Elizabeth might well feel that Mary was deliberately bolstering up her own pretensions by such a union. Darnley was even an English subject, hence the anglicised spelling of his family name compared to the Scottish spelling of Stuart. In the event, Elizabeth did make furious if fruitless attempts to veto the match beforehand. However, had Darnley possessed attributes other than the long-legged good looks which at first attracted Mary, some benefits might still have come out of the marriage. Mary badly needed a stable support against her factious and often outright associates, and thereby escape from Holyrood in a desperate horseback flight to Dunbar. Her subsequent return to Edinburgh at the head of a more loyal group of nobles was in the nature of a triumph. So let's have a look at some of the imagery on the left-hand side here. This is Mary Queen of Scots by an unknown artist after the portrait by Frances Clouet, probably painted at the time of her mourning for her father-in-law, Henry II. Now we also passed over these two images. On the right here we have James VI at the age of 8, painting attributed to R. Locke after Arnold van Bronckhorst. And here on the far right, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, with his younger brother Charles Stuart, Earl of Lennox, painted by Hans Eworth, 1563. The striking similarity between James and his father helps to disprove those theories which question his paternity. Okay, let's continue. Secondly, the question of James's own paternity became involved in the murky circumstances of Riccio's death. If Mary had been Riccio's mistress, could not Riccio have been James's father? The story may be dismissed on its timing alone. James was conceived soon after Mary's marriage, at the height of her infatuation for Darnley. Equally far-fetched is the legend that James died at birth, and an Erskine baby, son of the Earl of Mar, was substituted, a story based on the discovery of some nameless bones, not necessarily those of a child, in the walls of Edinburgh Castle in the 19th century. But, in any case, a comparison of James's portrait as a child with that of his father as a young man conveys a startling resemblance. My Lord God has given you and me a son, begotten by none but you, said Mary when she first showed the baby to Darnley, uncovering its face. Her version may be accepted, although her subsequent ominous prediction was perhaps less accurate. He is so much your own son that I fear it will be the worse for him hereafter. Nevertheless, the bitterly vicious rumour continued to haunt James even in adulthood. Henry IV coined one of his unfair yet all too memorable aphorisms when he said that James was so As the name indicated, they had risen. From the position of royal stewards to that of sovereigns via the marriage of Walter, sixth great steward, to Marjorie, daughter of Robert the Bruce. There was thus nothing sacrosanct and polemic about the Scottish Stuart monarchy, whose origins were so well known. A Stuart king was merely regarded as a primus inter pares. Most of the nobility were in some way or other related to the monarchy, which did not increase their respect for it. The rich earldom of Murray in the north-east had been granted to another Stuart, James's illegitimate uncle, the regent. The Earl of Lennox, James's grandfather, was another Stuart. The Erskine family were headed by the Earl of Mar, the traditional governor of an infant sovereign. There were many branches of the Douglas family. The Countess of Lennox had been a Douglas. One of these was headed by that Earl of Morton, implicated in Darnley's murder. The relationship of these groups to each other and to the throne at any given moment is inevitably confusing, for they shifted perpetually according to the dictates of territorial aggrandizement, religion, or family alliance. In their own domains, they enjoyed the advantages of a type of feudal jurisdiction, while the existence of their bands of family followers constituted a virtual standing army, something the sovereign did not have. At their best, these men had vigour and a capacity for survival. At their worst, they were capable of playing out power politics on a very rough scale indeed. At all times, they surrounded the throne like wolves, circling round a lone traveller, ever menacing, ever ready to pounce at a hint of weakness. And causes of weakness there could be only too many in the coming reign. Scotland was not a united nation religiously. The Act of Parliament, which in 1560 had changed the official religion of the country to Protestantism, ignored the fact that many of the population were still Catholics. In particular, the Catholic nobility soldiered on, encouraged by the rule of their co-religionists, Mary. Their possibilities of foreign intrigues would constitute a perpetual vexation to the adult James. As for those who professed the Reformed religion, diversions would begin to show between those who would now be termed Presbyterians and the Episcopalians who still supported their bishops. Religious differences apart, there were Scotland's economic difficulties. The Scottish crown was woefully short of funds, and as such incapable of mustering such luxuries as a standing army, or indeed any proper armed force at all, except by virtue of the nobles' cooperation. The fact that its properties had been much alienated not only decreased the royal income, but also robbed back the crown of actual supporters. In marked contrast to England, the Scottish Parliament was a negligible factor at this particular date. A single chamber, known as the Estates, its management was in the hands of a small body, the Lords of the Articles, who presented all business to it. Since the Lords of the Articles tended to represent whatever noble clique was in power, Parliament merely echoed this factious tendency. The system of Scottish land tenure at the moment of James's accession gave the Crown little proper chance to intervene 1567 was a stark, if powerfully beautiful country, barely emerged from the cocoon of a primitive way of life. There were fertile areas, it was true, such as the Kingdom of Fife on the east coast, which James's grandmother, Mary of Guise, had tactfully admired on her arrival from France. But there were also vast tracts such as the Highlands or indeed the debatable border country, where it was difficult to know whose law obtained. This wildness was helped on by the fact that communications were lamentable. Roads in general were so bad that it was hardly surprising that the first coach had been introduced to Scotland from France, only 5 years before James's birth. Travellers and other representatives of the unfamiliar were generally disliked. The inevitable consequence of distance and poverty was attachment to the local magnate as provider rather than to the crown as the central element in the state. It may well be asked what hope there was for a small child brought up in this unwelcoming wasp's nest from babyhood. Right, so on the right hand side here we have a map of Scotland. On the left hand side here we have the Hebrides, Lewis, Harris, North Oost, South Oost. We have the Orkney Islands on the right hand side at the top. And then here we have Inverness. Here are the Highlands. Here is the Isle of Mull, Isle of Skye, Islay, Kintyre, Arran. And here is Edinburgh, and here is Glasgow. Here is the Kingdom of Fife, Aberdeen, Elgin. Right at the top we have Thurso, and we have the Atlantic Ocean on the left, and on the right the North Sea. And here is the line that separates Scotland from England. Here is Jedburgh, Berwick, Galloway, Dumbarton, Stirling, Inverary. From such a disadvantaged beginning, how could James hope to do better than the early deaths of his male ancestors, the dramatic failure of his beautiful mother? The extraordinary story of King James in Scotland is that he did do better. He did learn to cope in some manner or other with problems not long before apparently demonstrated to be insoluble. For an explanation of the surprising courage, competence and resourcefulness which this son of the unstable Mary and the feeble Darnley displayed, it is necessary to delve into his pathetic, bleak, but ultimately highly instructive childhood. It is important to note that the first 36 years of James's life, with the exception of one short expedition to Scandinavia, were to be spent in Scotland. It was Scotland that was to form James, to twist him, if twisted he would be, or mould him successfully. Unlike his mother, whose dominant upbringing was in France, or his father, brought up in England, James was the nursling of the country of which he was absolutely